Coffee stained her cheap polyester apron, but it was the customer's sneer that actually burned. He shoved his greasy plate back, demanding an apology from a woman who could buy his entire bloodline. Before she could drop her minimum wage act, a tired mechanic in faded flannel stepped between them. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, emitting a low, sickly hum that seemed to drill directly into Dean's temples. He sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back of Sunnyside Diner, staring at a lukewarm mug of filter coffee that tasted distinctly of burnt tin. Across from him, his 7-year-old daughter Maya aggressively dragged a dull red crayon across a paper placemat, trying to color inside the lines of a smiling pancake. Dean rubbed his face. His hands smelled like Gojo pumice soap and stale motor oil, a scent permanently tattooed into his skin after 12 hours under the chassis of freight trucks. His lower back screamed with a dull throbbing ache every time he shifted on the torn vinyl. He didn't want to be here. He wanted to be asleep. But the fridge at their cramped apartment was empty save for a jar of pickles and half a carton of milk that expired Tuesday, and Maya had asked for fries. You don't say no to your kid when she asks for a $3 basket of fries, even if it means sitting in a diner that smells faintly of old mop water and fried onions. 2 booths down, Isabella was failing miserably at her job. She wore a faded yellow uniform that scratched terribly against her collarbones. Her name tag, crooked and smudged, read, Sarah. Isabella didn't know a single Sarah, nor did she care to. What she cared about was the catastrophic inefficiency of this restaurant. She had acquired the parent company of Sunnyside Diners 3 weeks ago in a hostile buyout mostly for the real estate. Before liquidating the brand, she decided to spend 3 days in the trenches unannounced to see if the franchise had any salvageable operational value. The verdict was grim. The point-of-sale system was a relic from the late 90s. The inventory management was a joke. She had already deduced that the night manager was stealing frozen beef patties by cross-referencing the delivery manifests with the trash volume. And the physical labor of carrying plates was deeply aggravatingly tedious. Her feet hurt. Her expensive custom-molded insoles were back at her penthouse, locked inside a pair of Italian leather boots. Right now, she was wearing discount store sneakers that felt like walking on concrete blocks. "Excuse me. Hello, are you deaf?" The voice snapped Isabella out of her mental calculation of the restaurant's quarterly losses. She turned. The man sitting at booth 4 was leaning out into the aisle. He wore a cheap polyester suit that desperately wanted to look expensive, paired with a Bluetooth earpiece blinking a quiet, obnoxious blue. "Yes, sir," Isabella said, keeping her voice entirely flat. She walked over, pulling a stained order pad from her apron. "Is there a problem?" "A problem." "Yeah, there's a problem." "Sarah," he sneered, jabbing a thick manicured finger at his plate, "I asked for the yolks runny. These are rubber. Look at this." He grabbed a fork and smashed the egg yolk. It held firm, a depressing, pale yellow disc. "I apologize," Isabella said. The words tasted like ash. In her actual life, she would have fired this man's entire department for speaking to her with that tone. "I can take them back to the kitchen." "I don't want them taken back. I want you to learn how to listen." The man barked, his volume rising. A few heads in the diner turned. "You write it down, runny, R-U-N-N-Y. Is it that hard? Or did you drop out of high school before they taught spelling?" Isabella felt a cold, familiar spike of adrenaline in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was the predatory instinct she usually reserved for boardroom negotiations. She calculated the cost of buying his employer and liquidating his pension. She took a slow breath, the scent of cheap maple syrup and bleach filling her lungs. "I will get you a new plate, sir." "No, you're going to get your manager," he demanded, suddenly standing up. He was tall, using his physical size to crowd her space. He stepped into the aisle, closing the distance. "I want your manager, and I want my meal comped. Now." He reached out and poked her hard in the shoulder. It was a small contact, but it crossed a line. Isabella's eyes went dark. She opened her mouth, fully prepared to break her cover, to absolutely dismantle this man's life with 3 phone calls. A heavy scrape of boots against cheap linoleum interrupted her. "Hey." The voice wasn't loud, but it was thick with exhaustion and rough around the edges. Both Isabella and the man turned. Dean stood a few feet away. He hadn't stood up with dramatic flair. In fact, his left knee had popped audibly when he rose from the booth. He looked terrible. His dark hair was flattened on one side from wearing a mechanic's cap all day, and there were dark circles under his eyes that looked like bruises. He held a crumpled paper napkin in one hand. "What do you want?" the man in the suit snapped, looking Dean up and down instantly, registering the grease stains and the frayed collar of his jacket. "I want to finish my coffee without listening to you whine about a $2 egg," Dean said. He didn't adopt a fighting stance. He just stood there, shoulders slumped, projecting a massive, immovable weariness. "Sit down." "Mind your own business, buddy, this incompetent wait." Dean closed the distance before the man could finish the sentence. He didn't throw a punch. He just stepped directly into the man's personal space, crowding him back against the edge of the Formica table. Dean smelled like hot iron and sweat, a sharp contrast to the man's cloying cologne. "I said," Dean murmured, his voice dropping an octave devoid of any Hollywood heroism, just raw vibrating annoyance. "Sit down." You poked her. Don't touch people. Eat your cold eggs, pay your bill, and get out of here before you ruin my kid's dinner. The suit tried to hold Dean's gaze, but the mechanic's eyes were dead and uncompromising. There was a volatile unpredictability in a man who simply didn't care about social decorum because he was too tired to process it. The suit swallowed hard, the Bluetooth light blinking against his cheek. "Whatever," the man muttered, breaking eye contact. "Place is a dump anyway." He threw a $5 bill onto the table, grabbed his briefcase, and pushed past Dean, heading for the exit with hurried, embarrassed steps. The bell above the door chimed a hollow farewell. Silence hung in the diner for a few seconds, save for the rhythmic clattering of plates from the kitchen and the relentless buzz of the neon sign in the window. Dean stood there for a moment, staring at the empty doorway. The adrenaline was already leaving his system, replaced immediately by a heavy, sour wave of regret. He felt stupid. He wasn't a vigilante. He was a 34-year-old single father who couldn't afford to get arrested for assault over a diner dispute. He rubbed the back of his neck, the coarse stubble scratching against his palm. He turned around and met Isabella's eyes. She was staring at him completely motionless. Her expression wasn't one of gratitude. It was pure, unadulterated shock. Nobody had stepped in front of her in 10 years. People moved out of her way. They deferred. They cowered. They agreed. But this man, smelling of grit and labor, had just inserted himself into a physical confrontation for a waitress he didn't know. "You good?" Dean asked, his voice gravelly. He didn't wait for an answer. He felt awkward, hyper-aware of the grease under his fingernails and the fact that a few other patrons were looking at him. Yes. Thank you." Isabella managed to say her usually sharp tongue, feeling thick and slow. She looked at the $5 bill on the table, then back up at him. "You didn't have to do that." "Yeah, well, guy was being a prick," Dean muttered, already turning away. "Can't stand people who talk down to service staff. It's weak." He walked back to his booth, sliding heavily into the vinyl seat. Maya looked up from her coloring a French fry hanging halfway out of her mouth. "Did you fight that man, Daddy?" she asked, her voice hushed with mild awe. "No, Bug. Just told him to use his inside voice," Dean said, forcing a small, tight smile. He picked up his cold coffee and took a sip, wincing at the bitterness. "Eat your fries before they turn to cardboard." Isabella stood in the aisle, clutching her order pad. She watched him interact with the little girl. The contrast was jarring. The sheer physical intimidation he had just projected was entirely gone, replaced by a gentle, almost defeated tenderness as he wiped a smudge of ketchup off the girl's cheek with a paper napkin. 10 minutes later, as Dean was finishing the dregs of his coffee, Isabella walked over. She carried a small plate with a slice of cherry pie. She slid it onto the table in front of Maya. "On the house," Isabella said, keeping her voice low. Dean looked at the pie, then up at Isabella. He noted the way she stood. Most waitresses at this hour slouch, beaten down by the shift. This woman stood impeccably straight, her shoulders squared, her gaze direct. It didn't match the cheap uniform. "Thanks," Dean said. "You don't need to do that. I know this place deducts comps from your paychecks." Isabella blinked, genuinely surprised. "How do you know that?" "Used to wash dishes at a diner on 4th Street when I was a teenager. Management is always the same," he said, pulling out a battered leather wallet. He began fishing out bills. "It's fine. Really. I can afford a slice of pie." Isabella said, a hint of irony bleeding into her tone that Dean couldn't possibly understand. She looked at his hands as he counted the money. The knuckles were heavily calloused, marred by white scars and grease that wouldn't wash out. "Name's Dean," he offered, sliding a 10 and 2/5s onto the table. The tab was $12. "Sarah," Isabel lied smoothly. "Thank you, Dean. Don't let guys like that get in your head." "Sarah," Dean said, standing up and helping Maya with her coat. It was a pink puffy jacket, worn thin at the elbows. "They yell because they ain't got nothing real in their lives. Just empty suits." Isabella felt a strange, sharp pang in her chest. Empty suits. She spent her entire life surrounded by them. She was arguably the architect of them. She watched Dean and Maya walk out into the cold night, the wind immediately biting at Dean's thin jacket as he picked the girl up to hurry her to a rusted blue Ford pickup in the lot. Isabella walked back to the table to clear it. She picked up the bills. $8 in tip on a $12 tab. A ridiculous, mathematically illogical tip from a man who clearly counted every single penny he owned. She held the worn, slightly damp $5 bill between her fingers. The paper felt heavy. She walked into the back room, ignoring the angry shout of the shift manager telling her table 6 needed water. She pulled a sleek, encrypted smartphone from her locker. She dialed a number. It rang once. "Arthur." Isabella said, her voice dropping the waitress affectation, entirely returning to the crisp, commanding tone of a CEO. "The audit is concluded. Send the termination papers to the regional director of Sunnyside. I want the entire upper management team gutted by Friday." "Understood, Ms. Sterling," Arthur's smooth, British-accented voice replied. "Shall I arrange the car to pick you up?" "Yes. And Arthur, I need a license plate run." Blue Ford pickup parked outside the diner on Route 9. Find out who owns it. Of course. A security issue. Isabella looked down at the crumpled bills in her hand. No, just a loose end. 3 days later, the air inside the depot garage tasted of diesel fumes, metal shavings, and impending doom. Dean wiped a rag across his forehead, leaving a faint smear of black grease above his eyebrow. He threw a heavy wrench into a red toolbox, the metal clanging sharply over the background roar of an air compressor. The garage was usually a symphony of loud, profane mechanics yelling over the noise of heavy machinery. But today, a suffocating tension hung over the concrete floor. Apex Logistics had bought out the freight company 2 weeks ago. Everyone knew what that meant. Private equity firms didn't buy local fleets to improve the holiday bonus structure. They bought them to strip the assets, fire the union workers, and sell the trucks to overseas buyers. Dean, office, now. Gary, the floor foreman, didn't even stop walking as he delivered the message. He just pointed a thick finger toward the glass-enclosed management office on the second floor of the warehouse and kept moving his face pale and tight. Dean felt his stomach drop. It was a cold, leaden feeling that settled right behind his ribs. He had rent due on Monday. Maya needed winter boots. The timing couldn't be worse. He grabbed an orange pumice towel, scrubbing violently at his hands as he walked toward the metal staircase. He tried to mentally calculate how much he had left in his savings account. $400, maybe $5. It wouldn't stretch. He climbed the stairs, his work boots heavy on the grating. He pushed open the door to the administrative floor. The contrast hit him instantly. The garage below was loud, dirty, and smelled of labor. This hallway was silent carpeted and smelled faintly of ozone from the heavy-duty copiers and a sharp, expensive espresso blend. He walked toward the main conference room, expecting to see Gary and maybe a low-level HR rep ready to hand him a severance folder. Instead, the glass walls of the conference room revealed a very different scene. There were 6 people inside. 5 of them were men in sharp, tailored suits, looking incredibly uncomfortable. They were looking at spreadsheets, occasionally shooting nervous glances toward the head of the table. Sitting at the head of the table was a woman. She had her back to the door, but her posture commanded the entire room. She was wearing a charcoal gray blazer that fit with lethal precision. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant twist. She wasn't speaking, just tapping a silver pen rhythmically against a leather-bound folio. The sound was quiet, but every man in the room seemed to flinch slightly with each tap. Dean knocked once on the glass and opened the door. "Gary said you wanted—" The tapping stopped. The woman turned her chair slowly. Dean froze. The face was identical. The sharp cheekbones, the intense, assessing dark eyes, the slight, almost imperceptible curve of her jawline. It was Sarah, the waitress from Sunnyside. But the context was so violently different that Dean's brain simply refused to stitch the two images together for a solid 5 seconds. There was no stained yellow polyester. There was no smell of old fryer grease. The woman looking at him was surrounded by an aura of absolute terrifying authority. She looked like someone who could end a man's career with a single signature. "Thank you, gentlemen. Step out," she said. Her voice was the same, but the tone was stripped of any subservience. It was cold steel. The men in suits scrambled. They literally bumped shoulders trying to get through the door, past Dean, desperate to escape her orbit. Within 10 seconds, the large conference room was entirely empty, save for Dean standing by the door in his stained coveralls, and the billionaire CEO sitting at the head of the mahogany table. Silence stretched between them. The hum of the central air conditioning felt loud in the quiet room. Dean looked at her, his mind racing, piecing it together. The strange way she stood at the diner, the comment she made about affording the pie, the total lack of fear when that suit had yelled at her. He felt a sudden hot flash of anger. He hated being played. He hated wealthy people who treated the working class like a zoo exhibit. "Sarah," Dean said, the name dripping with heavy sarcasm. He didn't step further into the room. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest to hide the grease stains on his shirt. "Or whatever your real name is." "Isabella Sterling," she said, leaning back in her chair. She didn't smile. She just observed him, her eyes tracking his defensive posture. "CEO of Apex Holdings." Dean let out a harsh, dry laugh. He looked up at the ceiling tile, shaking his head. "Right, course. Undercover boss. Why you slumming it for a TV show? Getting a kick out of watching people scrub plates for minimum wage before you fire them." "I was auditing a poorly managed asset before liquidating it," Isabella replied evenly, refusing to rise to his anger. "Sunnyside was a disaster. I wanted to see exactly how much money they were bleeding on the floor. So you put on an apron and played pretend." Dean pushed off the doorframe, his jaw tight. "Must have been real funny for you, watching me step up to that guy. Probably thought I was an idiot. Look at the dumb grease monkey trying to save the poor waitress. I didn't think you were an idiot," Isabella said, her voice dropping slightly, losing a fraction of its corporate edge. "I thought you were a statistical anomaly. People don't intervene, not unless there's a camera pointing at them or they have something to gain. You had nothing to gain. I have a daughter," Dean snapped, stepping forward, the anger making him reckless. He was about to lose his job anyway. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. "I don't let her see men treat women like garbage. Doesn't matter if you're a waitress or a CEO. It's about how you carry yourself." He stopped at the edge of the table, placing his heavy calloused hands on the polished mahogany. The contrast between his grimy knuckles and the pristine wood was stark. "So, you bought this fleet. You're cleaning house." Dean said, his voice dropping back to that low, dangerous rumble he had used in the diner. He looked her dead in the eye. "Did you drag me up here to humiliate me before you hand me a pink slip? Is this how billionaires get their kicks?" Isabella didn't flinch. She looked at his hands on her table. She remembered those hands, leaving $8 on a sticky diner counter. Money he clearly couldn't afford to lose, given freely to someone he thought was struggling. She met his angry gaze. "I didn't bring you up here to fire you, Dean," Isabella said quietly, the silence of the room amplifying the weight of her words. She opened the leather folio in front of her. "I brought you up here because I'm firing the floor manager, Gary, and I need someone who actually understands how things work on the ground to run the floor." Dean stared at her, his anger suddenly hitting a brick wall of confusion. The air compressor roared to life somewhere down below, a muffled vibration through the soles of his boots. He didn't know what game she was playing, but looking into Isabella's dark, unreadable eyes, he knew the rules had just violently changed. Paperwork felt heavier than engine blocks. Dean stared at the laminated clipboard in his hands, his thumb tracing the sharp plastic edge. He stood on the metal catwalk overlooking the depot floor, the ambient roar of impact wrenches and diesel engines washing over him. It had been 4 days since Isabella handed him the position. He hadn't accepted immediately. He had stood in that freezing conference room, demanding to know what the catch was refusing to be a pawn in some corporate PR game. She had looked at him with dead serious eyes and told him that the depot was hemorrhaging efficiency because the previous manager led through fear. She needed someone the men respected. Respect was currently bleeding out on the concrete. Down below the mechanics guys, Dean had shared cheap beers and complained about upper management would just last week were giving him wide berths. They looked at the clipboard like it was a weapon. He was management now. A suit without the tailored jacket. The alienation was a physical ache in his jaw brought on by grinding his teeth every time a conversation stopped as he walked past a bay. He descended the metal stairs, his boots clanging a hollow rhythm. He needed to check the manifest for the incoming overnight freight. The smell of exhaust and ozone wrapped around him familiar and suffocating. Up in the glass-walled office suspended above the floor, Isabella watched him. She held a porcelain cup of black tea, letting the heat seep into her palms. Her new assistant, a quiet man named Hayes, stood by the door with a tablet reading off the quarterly projections. Isabella wasn't listening. Her gaze was locked on Dean. He wasn't yelling. The old manager used to pace the floor, like a rabid dog screaming about turnaround times. Dean just walked up to a struggling junior mechanic, wrestling with a stubborn serpentine belt, handed his clipboard to the kid, and wedged his own hands into the engine block to guide the tensioner pulley. It was wildly inefficient by corporate standards. A manager doing manual labor was a waste of salary. Yet the daily throughput numbers on Hayes's tablet were up by 11%. Ms. CEO, Hayes asked softly, pausing his readout. Isabella blinked, pulling her attention back. Continue, Hayes. What are the depreciation metrics on the warehouse equipment? Trending poorly, Hayes replied, swiping his screen. Maintenance costs are up since Monday. The new floor manager has submitted requisition forms for replacing the pneumatic lines and overhauling the lifts in Bay 3 and 4. The algorithm flags this as unnecessary expenditure. Standard operating procedure is to run the equipment until critical failure, then replace. Isabella frowned. Standard procedure. It was how she had built a 9-figure empire. You don't fix what isn't fully broken. But her mind flashed to Dean in the diner, stepping between her and the angry customer. He didn't wait for things to break. He intervened. Deny the requisition, Isabella said automatically, the corporate instinct overriding the human one. Tell him to patch the lines. By Thursday afternoon, the tension on the floor had snapped into outright hostility. Dean stood in front of Bay 4. The massive hydraulic lift capable of hoisting a 12-ton cab was hissing. A thin, terrifying mist of hydraulic fluid was spraying from a hairline fracture in the primary seal. It smelled sweet and sick, pooling on the cracked concrete like dark blood. I said, "Move the rig, Tommy." Dean barked, his voice cutting through the garage noise. Tommy, a kid barely out of trade school, looked terrified. Management always said to just wrap it with high PSI tape and run it. The freight company needs this rig back by 5 Dean. If I don't finish the undercarriage, if that seal blows while you're under it, your skull turns into paste. Dean said, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm. He reached over and slammed his palm into the red emergency stop button on the control pillar. The lift shuddered, the hissing abruptly stopping as the pressure locked. Bay 4 is closed. Nobody walks under this lift. 10 minutes later, Dean's radio cracked. Dean, office. He didn't bother wiping the grease off his hands this time. He marched up the metal stairs, his temper running hot enough to melt lead. He pushed open the heavy glass door, ignoring Hayes, and walked straight into Isabella's office. She was standing by the window, wearing a structured navy dress that probably cost more than Dean's truck. She turned her expression unreadable. "You shut down a bay," Isabella stated. It wasn't a question. Dean walked right up to her pristine desk. He didn't care about the power dynamic. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy jagged piece of metal, a ruptured retaining ring he had pried off a secondary valve. He slammed it down on her desk. The heavy thud made the coffee in her cup tremble. A smear of black sludge transferred onto her immaculate white blotting paper. "Your algorithm told you to deny my requisition," Dean said, breathing heavily. "Your algorithm doesn't know that when a 30-year-old seal fails, it doesn't give a warning. It just drops 12 tons of steel." Isabella stared at the greasy metal ruining her desk. She felt a spike of defensive anger. The predictive models show that Lyft has another 6 months of operational viability. We are running a business. Dean, not a charity. You cannot halt production based on a hunch. A hunch? Dean let out a harsh, bitter laugh, dragging a hand through his hair. "I've been breathing the air in this garage for 10 years. I know what dying machinery sounds like. You think putting on a polyester apron for a weekend taught you how the real world works? You think you understand the floor because you poured coffee." The words hit her like physical blows. Isabella stiffened her posture, going rigid. People did not speak to her this way. They cowered. They agreed. "I hired you to increase efficiency," Isabella said, her voice dangerously quiet. "No, you hired me because you felt guilty." Dean shot back, leaning over the desk, his eyes burning into hers. "You felt guilty because a grease monkey treated you like a human being, and you realized you treat your employees like numbers on a spreadsheet. Well, here's a number for you. If that lift falls on Tommy, the lawsuit will cost you $5 million. The replacement seal costs $1,200. Approve the damn paperwork." He turned around and walked out, letting the glass door slam shut behind him. Isabella stood alone in the silent office. The ambient noise of the garage felt very far away. She looked down at the ruined blotting paper, the dark grease staining the crisp white surface. She reached out her perfectly manicured fingers, hesitating before she picked up the broken retaining ring. It was heavy. It smelled violently of chemicals and hard labor. It felt real. For the first time in her career, the spreadsheets felt like a lie. Rain lashed against the corrugated tin roof of the depot, a deafening drumbeat that masked the usual roar of the garage. It was past 8 on a Friday night. The floor was mostly empty, just a skeleton crew running diagnostics on the weekend fleet. Dean was in the break room staring at the vending machine. The fluorescent tube inside flickered, casting a sickly pale light over rows of stale potato chips and chemical-tasting pastries. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass. He was exhausted down to his marrow. Maya was at a sleepover with a school friend, meaning he didn't have to rush home to cook macaroni. But the silence of the empty apartment waiting for him felt heavier than the overtime. He was waiting to be fired. He had yelled at the CEO. He had damaged her property. He had halted production for 6 hours until a third-party vendor delivered the replacement seal he had ordered using his own personal credit card. He couldn't afford it, but he couldn't let Tommy work under that lift. The break room door clicked open. Dean didn't turn around. "Just grabbing a water. Jimmy, I'll be out of your way in a sec." I prefer tea, actually. Dean froze. He pushed off the vending machine and turned. Isabella stood in the doorway. She was completely unrecognizable from the boardroom tyrant of yesterday. She wore a simple beige trench coat over dark jeans and a plain black sweater. Her hair was down falling in loose, imperfect waves around her shoulders. She looked tired. There were faint shadows under her eyes that expensive concealer usually hid. She carried 2 large cardboard cups from a high-end coffee shop downtown. She walked in navigating the scuffed linoleum floor and set one of the cups on the scarred plastic table. "Black, 2 sugars, assuming your taste hasn't changed since Sunnyside," she said. Dean stared at the cup, then at her. He crossed his arms. "Am I fired?" "No," Isabella said, pulling out a plastic chair and sitting down. The chair squeaked violently in protest. She winced, but didn't stand up. She looked around the depressing room, the motivational poster from 1998, curling at the edges the smell of burnt microwave popcorn. "You're reimbursed. The accounting department processed the $1,200 to your card an hour ago, with a penalty fee attached to my personal account for overriding the requisition denial." Dean slowly lowered his arms. He walked over to the table and picked up the cup. The cardboard was hot, the smell of actual roasted beans, a sharp contrast to the diner sludge he was used to. He took a sip. It was perfect. "Why?" he asked, his voice low, lacking the fight from yesterday. "You had every right to terminate me for insubordination." "Because you were right," Isabella said softly, staring into her own cup. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the swirling dark liquid. "I don't know how the floor works. I know how to buy the building strip, the assets, and inflate the stock price. I spent 10 years learning how to remove the human element from the equation, because the human element is messy. It costs money." She finally looked up, meeting his eyes. The absolute certainty that usually armored her face was gone, replaced by a raw, uncomfortable vulnerability. "When you stood up for me at the diner, you didn't do a cost-benefit analysis." Isabella continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "You just saw someone getting crushed, and you stepped in. You did the same thing for Tommy yesterday. You don't manage machines, Dean. You manage people. I need someone who knows the difference." Dean sat down heavily in the chair opposite her. The silence stretched between them, heavy but no longer hostile. The rain continued to hammer the roof. "It's not easy," Dean muttered, running a callous thumb over the rim of his cup. "The guys look at me different now, like I sold out. Leadership is incredibly isolating," Isabella said, a bitter knowing smile touching the corner of her mouth. "You make the choice that keeps them alive, and they hate you for the inconvenience. It doesn't get easier. You just get used to the cold." Dean looked at her. He saw past the billions, past the tailored suits and the ruthless reputation. He saw a woman who was profoundly, deeply alone. A woman who had built a fortress of spreadsheets so high she forgot what the ground felt like. "Doesn't have to be entirely cold," Dean said quietly. Isabella blinked, the sudden gentleness in his voice catching her off guard. She felt a strange tightening in her chest, a physical reaction to a tone she hadn't heard directed at her in years. Not sycophancy, not fear. Just genuine human empathy. If you're going to stick around and actually run this place instead of just liquidating it, Dean continued, leaning forward slightly, you're going to need to learn how to talk to them. Not at them, with them. "I don't know how to do that." Isabella admitted the honesty feeling like a physical confession. Dean offered a small, crooked smile. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "I know a terrible diner down on Route 9. The coffee tastes like battery acid, but the booths are good for talking. You want to learn how the ground floor works, you start there." Isabel looked at him. For the first time in a decade, she wasn't calculating an angle. She wasn't looking for leverage. She just saw a man with grease on his knuckles and an unyielding moral compass. "I think," Isabella said, a genuine hesitant smile breaking across her face, softening her sharp features entirely. "I would like that very much." They sat there in the flickering fluorescent light of the break room drinking coffee, while the rain washed the city outside. The gap between their worlds was still massive, an ocean of class, money, and power. But as Dean talked about the specific quirks of the diesel engines, and Isabella listened, actually listened without a tablet or an algorithm, a bridge began to form. It wasn't built on corporate buyouts or hostile takeovers. It was built on the simple, radical act of seeing each other, stripped of titles and uniforms, just two imperfect people trying to keep the roof from caving in. Did you love Dean and Isabella's story? True strength isn't about bank accounts or power. It's about having the courage to protect others and the humility to change your perspective. If this story of unexpected connection and breaking down walls touched your heart, hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves a grounded emotional narrative, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep character-driven audio stories every single week.